The gunshot that shattered the evening silence sent Sarah Owens diving behind the water trough, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst through her ribs. And when she opened her mouth to scream, nothing came out except a strangled gasp that died in her throat like all the other words she had tried to speak for the past 3 years. Ethan Nash heard the commotion from inside his ranch house just outside Oro Grande, New Mexico territory, and grabbed his rifle before rushing to the window. The September sun of 1882 cast long shadows across his property, and there, crouched behind his water trough with her hands pressed against her ears, was a woman he had never seen before. Her dress was torn and dusty, her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and even from this distance he could see she was trembling. The rider who had fired the shot was already galloping away, laughing as he went, probably some drunk cowhand thinking it was funny to scare a lone traveler. Ethan set down his rifle and walked outside slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. She looked up at him with eyes the color of spring grass, wide and terrified, and tried to scramble backward even though there was nowhere to go. He held up both hands, stopping a good 10 feet away from her. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "He's gone. You're safe here. I'm Ethan Nash. This is my ranch." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, but she did not speak. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but then closed again. A flush of embarrassment colored her pale cheeks. "Are you hurt?" Ethan asked, taking one careful step closer. She shook her head quickly, still not speaking. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" Another nod, this one more hesitant. Ethan studied her for a moment, noting the way her fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress, how she kept glancing toward the road as if expecting more trouble. "Can you tell me your name?" She opened her mouth again, and he saw the struggle play across her face, the way her throat worked as if trying to force out words that simply would not come. Her eyes filled with frustrated tears, and she looked away, ashamed. Understanding dawned on Ethan then. She could not speak, whether from shock or something else he did not know. "It's all right," he said softly. "You don't have to talk. Are you hungry?" "Thirsty?" She nodded at the second question, and he smiled, hoping it would ease her fear. "Let me get you some water. Will you wait here?" Another nod. He went inside and filled a tin cup from the pitcher on his kitchen table, moving slowly when he came back outside so as not to startle her. She had stood up by then, brushing dust from her skirt with shaking hands. Up close, he could see she was probably in her early 20s, with delicate features and those remarkable green eyes that seemed to hold both intelligence and deep sorrow. She took the cup from him carefully, making sure their fingers did not touch, and drank deeply. When she handed it back, she mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Ethan said. He was 32 years old and had been alone on this ranch for 5 years, ever since his father had died and his mother had gone to live with his sister in Santa Fe. He had grown accustomed to solitude, even preferred it most days, but something about this frightened woman made his chest ache with an unfamiliar protectiveness. "Do you have somewhere to go? Someone expecting you?" She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "Were you traveling to Oro Grande?" A shrug this time, uncertain. Running from something? Her face crumpled slightly and she nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Ethan made a decision then, one that would change everything about his quiet, orderly life. "You can stay here tonight. I've got a spare room. In the morning, we'll figure out what to do next. Does that sound all right?" Relief washed over her features so profoundly that Ethan knew he had made the right choice, even if it was unconventional. She nodded eagerly, and this time when she mouthed "thank you," her eyes were bright with unshed tears of gratitude rather than fear. He led her inside, acutely aware of how small and feminine she seemed in his rough bachelor quarters. The house was clean enough, he supposed, though it lacked any woman's touch. Just sturdy furniture his father had built, a stone fireplace, simple curtains his mother had sewn years ago. The spare room had been his parents' bedroom once, and it still had his mother's old quilt on the bed. "You can sleep here," he said, pushing open the door. "I'll be right across the hall if you need anything. There's a basin and pitcher for washing up. Are you hungry? I was about to make supper." She nodded, then held up one finger as if asking him to wait. From a small bag he had not noticed before, she pulled out a pencil stub and a worn piece of paper. She wrote quickly and handed it to him. "My name is Sarah Owens. I am sorry I cannot speak. Thank you for your kindness." "Sarah," Ethan said, liking the way it sounded. "That's a pretty name. And you have nothing to apologize for. Come on, let's get some food in you." In the kitchen, he set about making a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, hyper-aware of her presence as she sat at his table, watching his every move with those cautious eyes. He wanted to ask her 100 questions, wanted to know what had happened to steal her voice and put that haunted look on her face, but he held his tongue. She would tell him in her own time, in her own way. When he set the plate before her, she wrote again. "May I help?" "Next time," he said. "Tonight you're a guest. Tomorrow we can work out the details if you decide to stay longer." She ate slowly, delicately, with better manners than he usually bothered with when he was alone. He found himself sitting up straighter, remembering to use his napkin. When was the last time he had shared a meal with anyone? Months, at least. After supper, Sarah insisted on washing the dishes, communicating her determination through gestures when he tried to protest. He let her, sensing she needed to feel useful, to feel like less of a burden. He dried each dish as she handed it to him, and they worked in comfortable silence as the evening darkened outside. That night, lying in his bed across the hall from where she slept, Ethan stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or impulsive decisions. His days followed a predictable pattern: tend the cattle, mend fences, break horses, go to town once a week for supplies. The loneliness had become such a constant companion that he barely noticed it anymore. Or at least, he had not noticed it until tonight, when the house suddenly felt alive again with another person in it. He thought about Sarah's green eyes, the way fear and hope seemed to war in them constantly. He thought about her silence, wondering what terrible thing had happened to cause it. And he thought about the relief on her face when he had offered her shelter, as if she had been wandering in the wilderness and finally found an oasis. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, his dreams were unusually peaceful. Sarah woke before dawn, years of habit making it impossible to sleep late even though her body ached with exhaustion. For a moment, she did not remember where she was, and panic seized her until she recognized the soft quilt, the clean room, the quiet house. Ethan's house. She was safe. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. 3 years. 3 years since she had spoken aloud, since that terrible night when her stepfather had discovered her trying to leave with the small inheritance her real father had left her. 3 years since his hands had closed around her throat, choking the life and the voice out of her while her mother watched and did nothing. The doctor had said her vocal cords were not permanently damaged, that physically she should be able to speak, but the words had stayed locked inside her ever since, trapped behind a wall of fear and trauma she could not seem to break through. She had tried, many times. Had opened her mouth to speak to the kind woman who had given her work in Santa Fe, to the priest who had offered her counsel, to the sheriff when her stepfather had tracked her down and dragged her back home. but nothing ever came out except rasping sounds and gasping breaths that sent her into panic attacks. Eventually, she had stopped trying, had learned to communicate through writing and gestures, had accepted that perhaps she would never speak again. A month ago, she had finally escaped for good, stealing away in the night while her stepfather was drunk and her mother was asleep. She had been making her way south with no clear destination, working odd jobs where she could, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings when she could not afford a room. Yesterday, she had been walking the road to Oro Grande when that drunk cowboy had decided to have his fun, firing his gun and laughing at her fear. And then Ethan had appeared, this quiet rancher with kind eyes and a gentle voice, offering her shelter without asking for anything in return. It seemed too good to be true, and Sarah had learned the hard way that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But she had been so tired, so scared, so desperate for a safe place to rest that she had accepted his offer. Now, in the soft morning light, she rose and dressed, braiding her hair carefully. She would help him with breakfast as thanks, and then she would move on. She could not stay here, could not impose on his kindness any longer than necessary. Men who seemed kind had a way of changing once they thought you owed them something. But when she emerged from her room and found Ethan already in the kitchen, building up the fire in the stove, he simply smiled at her and said, "Morning. I hope you slept well." She nodded, watching him warily. "I usually make a big breakfast," he continued, pulling out eggs and bacon. "Figure if I eat well in the morning I can work through lunch, but I can make something simpler if you prefer." Sarah moved to the table and wrote on her paper, "I can cook, let me help." "All right," he agreed easily. "I won't say no to that. My cooking is pretty basic. My mother tried to teach me, but I fear I was not the best student." They worked side by side, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as she cracked eggs into a bowl and sliced bread for toasting. Ethan moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and he did not try to make conversation beyond simple, practical comments about the food. It was surprisingly comfortable, this quiet morning routine with a stranger who did not feel quite so strange anymore. Over breakfast, Ethan said, "I've been thinking. If you need a place to stay for a while, I could use some help around here. The house gets away from me sometimes, and I'm no good at mending or sewing or any of the things my mother used to do. I could pay you a small wage, give you room and board." "Nothing improper," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "You'd have your own room, your privacy. I just thought, well, if you need work and a safe place, I can offer that." Sarah stared at him, her heart beating fast again, but this time with something other than fear. It was tempting, so tempting, but could she trust it? Could she trust him? He seemed to understand her hesitation. "I know you don't know me from Adam," he said quietly. "I know you've probably got good reasons to be cautious of strangers, especially men. But I give you my word, Sarah. I mean you no harm. I've been alone out here for a long time and I've gotten used to it, but I'd be lying if I said the company wouldn't be welcome. And you look like you could use a place to catch your breath, figure out your next step. No obligations, no expectations beyond honest work. If you decide you want to leave, you can leave. I won't stop you." She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of the cruelty she had learned to recognize in her stepfather. But Ethan's brown eyes were clear and honest, his expression open. He was a handsome man, she realized suddenly, with strong features weathered by sun and wind, dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. But more than his appearance, there was something solid about him, something steady and reliable that called to the frightened, exhausted part of her soul. She picked up her pencil and wrote. "How long?" "As long as you need," he said simply. A week, a month, longer, whatever suits you. What kind of work? Cooking, cleaning, mending. I've got clothes that need patching, curtains that need washing. The garden my mother used to keep has gone to weeds. Whatever you're comfortable doing. And like I said, I'll pay you fairly. Sarah thought about it, weighing her options. She could move on, keep running, keep looking over her shoulder and jumping at shadows. Or she could stay here, at least for a little while, and rest. The idea of having a safe place, a warm bed, regular meals was almost overwhelming in its appeal. Finally, she wrote, 1 month. We will see how it goes. Ethan's face lit up with a smile that transformed his normally serious expression. That sounds perfect. Thank you, Sarah. She found herself almost smiling back, something she had not done in longer than she could remember. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm that Sarah had never experienced before. She rose early and made breakfast, finding that Ethan had not exaggerated his lack of cooking skill. She took pride in serving him proper meals, flapjacks with syrup, eggs cooked just right, bacon that was crispy but not burned. He always thanked her with genuine appreciation, and she found herself lingering over their morning meals, enjoying the quiet companionship. After breakfast, Ethan would go out to work on the ranch, and Sarah would tackle the housework. The first day, she had been shocked at the state of some things. Dust-coated surfaces that had not been properly cleaned in years, curtains were gray with grime, and she found a pile of mending in a basket that must have been accumulating for months. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, she felt purposeful. This was work she could do, work she was good at, and every improvement she made to the house gave her a sense of accomplishment. Ethan came in for lunch on her third day there, something he admitted he rarely did, and found her scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees. He stood in the doorway, looking embarrassed. "I should have done that before you got here," he said. "I'm sorry you're having to work so hard." She sat back on her heels and wrote quickly, "I like it. It feels good to make things clean and nice." "Well, it looks wonderful," he said, gazing around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. "The whole house does. It hasn't been this clean since my mother left. She'd be pleased." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. When was the last time someone had praised her work, her efforts? Her mother had always found fault with everything she did, and her stepfather had only noticed her to criticize or worse. That afternoon, while she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Ethan brought one of his horses to the nearby corral to work with it. She found herself watching as he patiently worked with the young mare, his movements slow and deliberate, his voice a constant, soothing murmur she could not quite make out. The horse was skittish at first, but gradually calmed under his gentle handling, and Sarah felt an unexpected kinship with the animal. She knew what it was like to be frightened, to expect cruelty, and to be surprised by kindness instead. Ethan glanced over and caught her watching. He waved, and she felt her face heat with embarrassment at being caught staring. But he just smiled and called out, "She's coming along nicely. Another week or so and she'll be ready to ride." Sarah nodded and returned to her work, but she continued to steal glances at him, fascinated by his patience, his calm competence. That evening, after supper, Ethan lingered at the table instead of heading outside to finish his evening chores as he usually did. Sarah was washing dishes when she felt him watching her, and she turned to find him with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." She dried her hands and picked up her pencil, nodding. "Have you always been unable to speak, or did something happen?" Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she wrote. "Something happened 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "That must have been hard." She wrote again. "The doctor said physically I should be able to speak, but I cannot." The words will not come. Maybe they will someday, Ethan said, when you feel safe enough. The simple understanding in his words made Sarah's eyes sting with tears. She nodded, not trusting herself to look at him directly. Well, whenever that day comes, or even if it never does, you're welcome here, Ethan continued. I like having you here, Sarah. The house feels like a home again. She did look at him then, and the genuine warmth in his expression made something loosen in her chest. Some tight knot of fear and loneliness that had been wound so tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. The days turned into a week, and then two. Sarah found herself relaxing in increments so small she barely noticed them at first. She stopped jumping at sudden noises. She began to sleep through the night without nightmares waking her. She caught herself humming sometimes while she worked, no sound emerging but the ghost of melody in her throat. Ethan continued to treat her with unfailing kindness and respect. He never entered her room, never touched her beyond the occasional accidental brush of hands when passing dishes or tools, never looked at her with anything other than friendly regard. He talked to her during meals, telling her about his day, about the ranch, about his plans for the future. He asked her opinion on things, waiting patiently while she wrote her responses, treating her written words with the same weight as if she had spoken them aloud. She learned that he had inherited the ranch from his father, who had built it up from nothing. She learned that his mother had wanted him to marry, to have children, to fill the house with family, but that he had never found anyone who understood his love for this land and this life. She learned that he was well respected in Oro Grande, that he was known for his fair dealing and his skill with horses, that he had friends but preferred his own company most of the time. I suppose I'm what people call a loner, he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. My mother used to worry about me, said I'd end up old and alone, but I've always been comfortable with solitude, or I thought I was. Sarah looked at him questioningly, and he met her gaze. Having you here has shown me the difference between being alone and being lonely, he said quietly. I was lonely. I just didn't realize it. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she felt the same way, that for the first time in 3 years, she felt like a person again instead of just a frightened animal running from predator to predator. But the words stayed locked inside, so she simply reached out and placed her hand briefly over his, a gesture of understanding and shared feeling. His hand turned beneath hers, his fingers closing gently around hers for just a moment before she pulled away, suddenly shy. But the warmth of his touch stayed with her long after she went to bed that night. The next Sunday, Ethan asked if she would like to go to town with him for supplies. Sarah hesitated, anxiety immediately flooding her at the thought of being around strangers, of the questions they would ask that she could not answer. But Ethan seemed to sense her fear. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to, he said. I'll do all the talking. But I thought you might like to get out for a bit, see something besides the ranch, and you could pick out some things for yourself. Fabric, maybe, if you want to make a new dress. Some books, if you like to read. The offer was too tempting to refuse. Sarah did love to read, and she had not had a new book in months. And the idea of choosing fabric, of making something pretty for herself, appealed to a part of her she had thought was dead. So she nodded, and that afternoon they rode into Oro Grande together in Ethan's wagon, Sarah trying not to show how nervous she was. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a bank, and a handful of other buildings. But after weeks of seeing no one but Ethan, it felt overwhelming and crowded even though there were only a dozen or so people visible. Ethan helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist, and she tried not to think about how much she liked his touch, how safe it made her feel. They went into the general store, and immediately the proprietor, a round man with a friendly face, called out a greeting. "Ethan Nash, good to see you, and who's this?" "This is Sarah Owens," Ethan said easily. "She's helping me out at the ranch. Sarah, this is George Patterson. He runs the best store in the territory." "The only store for 20 miles, George laughed. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Owens." Sarah smiled and nodded, and when she did not speak, George glanced at Ethan questioningly. Ethan said calmly, "Sarah doesn't speak, but she communicates just fine in other ways. We need the usual supplies, and she'd like to look at your fabric and books." Of course," George said, adapting quickly. "The fabric is along the back wall, Miss Owens, and the books are on that shelf there. Not a huge selection, I'm afraid, but there are a few good ones." Sarah nodded her thanks and moved toward the back of the store, aware of Ethan staying close, a protective presence that kept the curious stares of the other customers from feeling too intrusive. She found herself drawn to a bolt of blue calico, the color of a clear sky, and ran her fingers over it longingly. "That would look beautiful on you," Ethan said from behind her. "Get enough for a dress, and anything else you want." She looked at him, startled, and wrote, "It is too much." "It's not too much," he said firmly. "You've been working hard. You deserve something nice. Please, Sarah, let me do this for you." The genuine desire to give her something, to see her happy, was clear in his face, and Sarah felt that strange loosening in her chest again, that slow thawing of something frozen. She nodded and selected the fabric, and then chose 2 books, both novels she had heard of but never had the chance to read. At the counter, while George was tallying up their purchases, a woman approached them. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with sharp eyes that took in everything. "Ethan Nash, I heard you had a woman living with you," she said without preamble. "This must be her." "Mrs. Morrison," Ethan said, his voice cooling slightly. "This is Sarah Owens. She's my housekeeper. Sarah, Mrs. Morrison, is the banker's wife." Mrs. Morrison looked Sarah up and down critically. "Housekeeper? Is that what we're calling it?" Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment and shame, but Ethan stepped slightly in front of her, his shoulders squared. "Yes, that's what we're calling it, because that's what it is," he said, his voice hard in a way Sarah had never heard before. "Sarah is a respectable woman who works for me. If you're implying something improper, Mrs. Morrison, I suggest you keep your thoughts to yourself." Mrs. Morrison sniffed. "I'm merely concerned for propriety. An unmarried woman living alone with an unmarried man. People will talk." "Let them talk," Ethan said flatly. "My conscience is clear, and so is Sarah's. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have shopping to finish." He turned his back on her, a deliberate dismissal, and Mrs. Morrison huffed off in a rustle of skirts. George looked apologetic as he wrapped their purchases. "Don't mind her," he said quietly. "She thinks she's the guardian of the town's morals, but most folks know she's just a busybody. Nobody who knows you would think anything improper, Ethan." "I appreciate that, George," Ethan said, but Sarah could see tension in his jaw that had not been there before. On the ride home, Sarah wrote, "I am sorry. I did not think about how it would look. I can leave if it causes you trouble." "No," Ethan said immediately, sharply, then softened his tone. "No, Sarah, please don't leave. I meant what I told Mrs. Morrison. I don't care what people think. You've done nothing wrong, and neither have I. If anyone has a problem with it, that's their problem, not ours." But Sarah could see that it bothered him more than he was letting on, and guilt gnawed at her. She had brought complications into his simple, orderly life. The last thing she wanted was to cause him trouble or damage his reputation. That night, she lay awake thinking about it. She could leave. She had a little money now from the wages Ethan had insisted on paying her, even though he had already given her so much. She could go to another town, find other work. But the thought of leaving made her chest ache in a way she did not want to examine too closely. She had been happy here, happier than she had been in years. The ranch felt like home, and Ethan felt like something she could not quite name, something more than an employer, more than a friend, something that scared her and thrilled her in equal measure. The next morning at breakfast, Ethan seemed distracted, thoughtful. Finally, he set down his coffee and looked at her directly. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Morrison said," he began, and Sarah's heart sank. Here it came. He was going to ask her to leave. But then he continued, "About propriety and appearances, and I have an idea, but you might think I'm crazy." She gestured for him to continue. "What if we got married?" Sarah's eyes went wide, and she nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "Not a real marriage," Ethan clarified quickly. "I mean, it would be legal, but it would be in name only. For appearances. So no one could question your being here, your reputation. We'd continue on just as we are now, separate rooms, no expectations. But as my wife, you'd have legal protection, financial security, and no one could say a word against you, against us." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. Marriage, even a marriage in name, only seemed impossible, overwhelming, terrifying. But also, a small voice whispered, safe. As his wife, she would have legal protection from her stepfather if he ever tracked her down. She would have a home, a place where she truly belonged, but it was too much to ask of him, too much to accept. She wrote frantically, "You cannot do that. You should marry someone you love. Have a real family." "I'm 32 years old," Ethan said quietly. "I've had plenty of opportunities to fall in love and get married, and it hasn't happened. Maybe it's not meant to happen for me, but I care about you, Sarah. I care about your safety and your happiness. This would solve both our problems. You'd have security, and I'd have someone to share this place with to make it a home. It seems like a practical solution." Practical. The word should have reassured her, but instead it made her feel hollow. Of course it was just practical for him. "Why would it be anything else?" she wrote. "Let me think about it." "Of course," Ethan said. "Take all the time you need." But that night, lying in bed, Sarah could not stop thinking about it. Marriage to Ethan, even a marriage of convenience, would mean safety in a way she had never known. It would mean a home, a purpose, a life. And if her heart ached a little at the idea of being his wife in name only, well, that was something she would have to manage. She had no right to expect more from him. He was offering her an enormous gift, and she would be a fool to refuse it. In the morning, she found Ethan in the barn, grooming one of the horses. She stood in the doorway until he looked up and saw her. She held out the paper on which she had written a single word. Yes. His face lit up with that transforming smile, and he crossed to her in 3 long strides. For a moment she thought he might embrace her, and her heart leaped and sank at the same time, but he caught himself and simply took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he said. "I promise I'll take care of you, Sarah. I'll be a good husband, even if it's not in the traditional way." She nodded, wishing desperately that she could tell him that he was already good, that he had already given her more than anyone else ever had, that the thought of being his wife, even in name only, made her happier than she had any right to be. They were married 3 days later in Oro Grande, in a simple ceremony at the church with George Patterson and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore the new blue calico dress she had made, finished in a rush of activity that left her fingers sore from the needle. Ethan wore a suit she had not seen before, and he looked so handsome her breath caught in her throat. The ceremony was brief. When the preacher asked for her vows, Sarah nodded her consent, and Ethan spoke for both of them, his voice steady and sure. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and said Ethan could kiss his bride, there was an awkward moment where they both hesitated. Then Ethan leaned in and pressed a chaste, gentle kiss to her forehead, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness of it. Mrs. Morrison was at the church, her expression sour, but she could say nothing now. Sarah was a respectable married woman. They went back to the ranch that afternoon, and everything was the same and yet completely different. Sarah was now Mrs. Nash, a name that felt strange and wonderful on the documents she signed. That evening, Ethan seemed nervous for the first time since she had met him. "I want you to know that nothing has to change," he said as they stood awkwardly in the kitchen after supper. "You keep your room. We continue on as we have been. This was purely for practical purposes." "I know," Sarah wrote, even though a part of her wished desperately that it was not purely practical, that it meant something more. "Good," Ethan said, but he looked almost disappointed, though that was probably just her imagination. "Well, good night then. Sarah Nash," he added with a small smile. She smiled back, her heart aching with complicated feelings she could not name, and went to her room alone. The weeks that followed their marriage were both wonderful and painful. Wonderful because Sarah felt truly safe for the first time in years, because she had a home and a purpose, and someone who treated her with kindness and respect. Painful because she was falling in love with her husband, and he had made it clear that their marriage was one of convenience only. She tried to hide her growing feelings, but it was hard when everything Ethan did seemed designed to make her love him more. The way he always thanked her for meals. The way he brought her wildflowers he had found while riding the range. The way he sat with her in the evenings, reading aloud from books while she mended his shirts, his voice a soothing rumble that made her feel content and restless at the same time. She caught herself watching him constantly, memorizing the way he moved, the sound of his laugh when something amused him, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses. She found herself making his favorite foods, mending his clothes with extra care, finding small ways to please him. And sometimes she caught him watching her too, with an expression she could not quite read. Hunger, almost, or longing, but then he would look away and the moment would pass, and Sarah would tell herself she was imagining things, projecting her own feelings onto him. October slipped into November, and the weather turned cold. Ethan spent long days preparing for winter, cutting wood and making sure the barn and fences were secure. Sarah preserved food, made warm quilts, prepared the house for the harsh months ahead. They worked side by side, a team, a partnership, and it was so easy to pretend they were a real married couple, so easy to forget that this was all an arrangement of convenience. One evening in late November, Ethan came in from the cold with snow dusting his hair and shoulders. Sarah had hot coffee waiting and stew simmering on the stove. He smiled at her gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around the cup she handed him. "Smells wonderful," he said. "You take such good care of me, Sarah," she wrote. "You take care of me too. Do I?" He asked, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "Sometimes I worry that I'm being selfish, keeping you here in this arrangement. You're young, Sarah. You should have a real marriage, a real husband, children if you want them, a full life." Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote, "I am happy here." "Are you?" Ethan asked, and he set down his cup and took a step closer to her. "Truly happy, or are you just grateful for a safe place?" She did not know how to answer that, how to explain the complicated tangle of feelings in her heart. So she wrote simply, "Both." He nodded slowly, and something like sadness crossed his face. "You deserve more than both, Sarah. You deserve everything." He turned away then, going to stand by the window, looking out at the falling snow. Sarah wanted to go to him, to tell him that he was wrong, that she had everything she wanted right here. But the words were locked inside her as always, and even writing them felt impossible. How could she confess her feelings when he had been so clear that this marriage was not real? She would only embarrass them both and ruin the comfortable friendship they had built. But that night, lying alone in her bed, she made a decision. She would try to speak again. She would try to find her voice, because there were things she needed to say to Ethan, things that could not be adequately expressed on paper. She did not know if it was possible after 3 years of silence, but she had to try. The next morning she stood in front of the small mirror in her room and opened her mouth, willing words to come out. "Hello," she tried to say, but nothing emerged except a rushing exhale of breath. She tried again. "Ethan." But again nothing, just air and silence. Frustration and fear rose in her throat, threatening to choke her just as her stepfather's hands had years ago, and she pressed her palms to the dresser, breathing hard, fighting down panic. She could not do this. The fear was too strong, the memory too powerful. Her voice was gone, and it was never coming back. But then she thought of Ethan, of the kindness in his eyes, of the way he had protected her and cared for her and made her feel human again. If he could be brave enough to offer her marriage, to change his whole life for her safety and comfort, surely she could be brave enough to try to speak. Surely she owed him that much. So she tried again, day after day, when she was alone in the house and Ethan was out working. Sometimes she would get so frustrated she would cry, silent tears streaming down her face as she stood in front of the mirror and mouthed words that would not come. But she kept trying, because giving up felt like surrendering the last part of herself that her stepfather had not taken. December arrived with heavy snows that kept Ethan close to the house. They spent long evenings by the fire, and Sarah noticed that Ethan seemed restless, troubled. He would start to say something, then stop. He would look at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch, but then he would look away. Finally, one evening when the wind was howling outside and the fire was burning low, Ethan set aside the book he had been reading and turned to her. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was rough with some emotion she could not identify. "And I need you to hear me out before you respond, all right?" She nodded, setting aside her mending, her heart suddenly racing. "This marriage," he began, "was supposed to be practical, convenient, a solution to a problem. That's what I told you, and that's what I believed when I proposed it." He paused, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristically agitated gesture. "But I was lying to myself, Sarah. Or maybe I was lying to both of us." She stared at him, not understanding, and he met her gaze directly. "I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "Maybe I was already half in love with you that first day when you were so scared and I wanted nothing more than to make you feel safe. Maybe it happened over these months of sharing meals and conversations and this life together. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it's true. I love you, Sarah. I'm in love with you." Sarah felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. She could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at him in shock. "I know this isn't what you signed up for," Ethan continued. "I know I promised this would be in name only, no expectations. And I'll keep that promise if that's what you want. We can continue on just as we are. But I had to tell you the truth. I had to tell you that every day I wake up grateful that you're here, that every time I see you I want to hold you and kiss you and be a real husband to you. I had to tell you that I dream of a future where this is a real marriage, where maybe we have children together, where we grow old on this ranch side by side." He stopped, breathing hard, and Sarah realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face. He immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've upset you. I shouldn't have said anything. Please forget I spoke. We'll go back to how things were." But Sarah was shaking her head frantically, and her mouth was opening, and she was trying so hard to speak. to tell him that she loved him too, that she had been falling in love with him for months, that his words were the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Her throat worked, sounds emerging that were not quite words, and Ethan stood and crossed to her, kneeling in front of her chair. "It's all right," he said gently. "You don't have to speak, just write it. Tell me what you're thinking." But Sarah did not want to write it. She wanted to say it, to give him her voice as he had given her his heart. She tried again, her hands clutching his shoulders, her eyes locked on his. She managed, the word barely more than a whisper, rough and broken but audible. Ethan's eyes went wide. "Sarah." She tried again, and this time it was a little stronger. "I love." She stopped, gasping, tears flowing harder, but they were tears of joy now, of triumph. She had spoken. After 3 years of silence, words had finally emerged. "I love you," she managed, all 3 words running together but understandable. "I love you, Ethan." His face transformed, joy and wonder and love shining in his eyes, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close, and she was clinging to him and crying and trying to speak again. "I love you," she said against his shoulder, her voice rough and unpracticed but real, so real. "I love you, I love you." "Sarah," he breathed, and then he was pulling back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Say it again." "I love you," she said, and it was easier this time, the words coming more naturally. "I have loved you for so long." And then he was kissing her, really kissing her, not the chaste press of lips to forehead from their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and full of all the longing and love they had both been holding back. Sarah kissed him back with all the feeling in her heart, her hands tangling in his hair, and she thought that this was what she had been waiting for her whole life, this feeling of being loved and safe and free. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "Your voice," he said wonderingly. "You found your voice." "You helped me find it," Sarah said, and speaking was still difficult, still required effort, but it was getting easier with each word. "You made me feel safe enough to try." "I will always keep you safe," Ethan promised. "Always. I love you so much, Sarah." "I love you too," she said. And then she laughed, the sound rusty but genuine, and Ethan laughed too, and they held each other by the fire as the snow fell outside and the wind howled. But inside there was only warmth and love and joy. That night, there was no awkward parting to separate rooms. Ethan took Sarah's hand and led her to his bedroom, and she went willingly, eagerly, ready to make their marriage real in every way. He was gentle with her, patient, making sure she was comfortable and willing at every step, and Sarah felt cherished and desired and loved in a way she had never imagined possible. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest and his hand stroking her hair, Sarah whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Ethan murmured. "For waiting, for being patient, for helping me find my voice." "You found it yourself," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I just tried to give you a safe place to heal." "You gave me so much more than that," Sarah said. "You gave me a home, a life, love, everything." "And you gave me the same," Ethan said. "I was so lonely before you came, Sarah. I didn't even realize how lonely I was until you showed me what it was like to share my life with someone. You made this house a home. You made me happy." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Sarah slept more peacefully than she had in years. The winter was long but happy. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each passing day, though it was often hoarse by evening from disuse over the years. She and Ethan talked constantly, making up for months of one-sided conversations. She told him about her childhood, about her real father who had died when she was young, about her mother remarrying a man who seemed kind at first but showed his true colors once he had legal control over Sarah's inheritance. She told him about that terrible night when she had tried to run away, and he had nearly killed her, about the years of fear and silence that followed, about finally escaping and wandering until that drunk cowboy had chased her to Ethan's ranch. Ethan held her through the telling, his arms tight around her, his voice fierce when he said, "He'll never touch you again. You're mine now, and I protect what's mine." And Sarah felt safe enough to tell him the darkest parts of her past because she knew he meant every word. She learned more about him too, about the loneliness of his childhood as an only child on an isolated ranch, about the weight of expectations when his father died and left him responsible for everything, about the women who had shown interest in him over the years, but never understood his love for this land and this life. "I always knew I wanted someone who could love this place as much as I do," Ethan told her one night as they lay in bed watching the moonlight through the window. "Someone who understood that this isn't just a ranch, it's a legacy, a home. But I never found her until you stumbled into my life scared and silent and brave." "Brave?" Sarah questioned. "I wasn't brave, I was terrified." "You were both," Ethan insisted. "You kept going even though you were terrified. That's the definition of bravery." In early March, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Sarah realized she might be pregnant. She waited another few weeks to be sure before telling Ethan, and when she finally did, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then set her down carefully as if she was made of glass. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy." Ethan cupped her face and kissed her soundly. "I'm overjoyed." "Thrilled. This is everything I ever wanted, Sarah. A real marriage, a real family, with the woman I love." Over the following months, as Sarah's belly grew, Ethan was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He insisted she rest more, worked harder to take on tasks she normally would have done, and worried constantly about her health and the baby's health. Sarah found it endearing even when it was exasperating. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she told him one day when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I know," he said sheepishly. "I just want to take care of you." "You do take care of me," Sarah assured him, "but I also need to feel useful. Let me do the things I can do, and I'll ask for help when I need it." They compromised, and the summer passed peacefully. Sarah sewed baby clothes while Ethan built a cradle from wood he carefully selected and sanded until it was perfectly smooth. They argued playfully about names, each suggesting increasingly ridiculous options until they were both laughing. In September, exactly 1 year after Sarah had first arrived at the ranch, she went into labor. Ethan rode to Oro Grande to fetch the doctor and the doctor's wife, who served as midwife for the area. The labor was long and difficult, and Ethan paced outside the bedroom door, looking haggard with worry. But finally, in the early hours of the morning, a baby's cry rang out, and the midwife opened the door to tell him he had a son. Ethan rushed in to find Sarah exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. She looked up at him with tired eyes full of love. "Meet your son," she said softly. Ethan sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're both beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas, after Ethan's father, and he was the joy of their lives. Ethan was a devoted father, doting on his son even when Thomas woke them multiple times a night. Sarah would often wake to find Ethan already out of bed, walking the floor with Thomas in his arms, singing softly to soothe him back to sleep. "You're going to spoil him," Sarah teased one morning after a particularly difficult night. "I don't care," Ethan said, grinning at her over Thomas's fuzzy head. "He's my son. I'm allowed to spoil him." The years that followed were full and happy. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler, and Sarah's voice grew stronger until most people would never know she had once been unable to speak. She still had moments when stress or fear made the words stick in her throat, but with Ethan's patient support, she always found her voice again. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Ethan's mother, and another son they named James. The house that had once been so quiet and lonely was now filled with laughter and the thunder of small feet, with arguments and tears and joy and love. Ethan expanded the ranch, buying more cattle and hiring hands to help with the work. Sarah's garden flourished, and she sold her excess produce in Oro Grande, earning a reputation for the best vegetables in the area. They became pillars of the small community, respected and liked by most, though Mrs. Morrison remained coolly disapproving whenever their paths crossed. "I don't think she's ever forgiven us for proving her wrong," Sarah said one day after a particularly frosty encounter in the general store. "Some people are only happy when they're finding fault," Ethan said philosophically. "Let her be miserable if that's what she wants. We have too much to be grateful for to worry about one bitter woman." He was right, Sarah thought. They had so much to be grateful for. She had a loving husband, beautiful children, a home she loved, and her voice, her precious voice that she had once thought was lost forever. One evening in the spring of 1892, 10 years after Sarah had first arrived at the ranch, she and Ethan sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 12 now, tall and lanky like his father, and he was teaching Elizabeth, who was 8, how to rope a post while 5-year-old James tried to imitate them with a piece of string. "You ever think about that first day?" Ethan asked, taking Sarah's hand in his. "When you stumbled onto my property scared and unable to speak?" "I think about it often," Sarah said. "I think about how close I came to just keeping walking, to not accepting your help. My life would be so different if I had." "Mine too," Ethan said. "I'd probably still be living alone in that house, eating burned food and wearing shirts with holes in them, convinced I was fine with my solitary life." Sarah laughed. "You weren't fine, though, were you?" "No," Ethan admitted. "I was lonely and didn't even realize it." "You changed everything, Sarah. You brought life and love and joy into my world. You gave me a family, a real home, everything I ever wanted but was too stubborn to admit I needed." "You gave me the same," Sarah said softly. "You gave me safety and patience and love. You waited for me to find my voice, and you never made me feel less than whole even when I couldn't speak. You saved me, Ethan." "We saved each other," Ethan said, and he leaned over to kiss her, long and sweet and full of the deep love that a decade of marriage had only strengthened. When they pulled apart, Thomas was making exaggerated gagging noises and Elizabeth was giggling while little James looked confused. "Why are you kissing?" he asked loudly. "Because I love your mother," Ethan called back, not at all embarrassed, "and someday you'll understand." Thomas rolled his eyes dramatically, but he was grinning, and Sarah felt her heart swell with love for her family, for this life she had built from the ashes of her past. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Sarah thought about the scared, silent woman she had been, and the strong, happy woman she had become. She thought about the power of kindness, of patience, of love to heal even the deepest wounds. She thought about how finding her voice had been about more than just speaking words. It had been about finding herself, claiming her place in the world, learning to trust and love again. And she thought about the lonely rancher who had taken in a frightened stranger and given her everything, who had waited with infinite patience for her to heal, who had loved her even when she could not speak, and who continued to love her more with each passing year. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her reflective expression. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Sarah said. "How blessed we are." "I'm the lucky one," Ethan said. "You made my house a home and my life complete." "We both are then," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "Lucky and blessed and loved." As darkness fell, and they called the children inside for supper, Sarah knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfection, not a life without struggles or challenges, but a life filled with love and family and the daily choice to be there for each other, to support and cherish and honor the commitment they had made all those years ago. The lonely rancher and the woman who had lost her voice had found each other in the vast emptiness of the New Mexico territory, and together they had built something beautiful and lasting. They had built a home, a family, and a love that would endure for all the years to come. Years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Ethan and Sarah's love deepened in the way of couples who have weathered life's storms together and emerged stronger. They had arguments, of course, disagreements about how to handle problems or discipline the children or spend money, but they always worked through them, always remembered that they were on the same side. Thomas showed an aptitude for ranching that delighted Ethan, following his father around and learning every aspect of the business. Elizabeth was quieter, more introspective, and she loved books and drawing. Sarah encouraged her daughter's artistic interests, remembering her own love of reading and how much comfort it had brought her in dark times. James was the wild card, energetic and fearless, constantly getting into scrapes and keeping his parents on their toes. When Thomas was 16, a stranger came to the ranch. Sarah was hanging laundry when she looked up and saw a man on horseback approaching, and something about him made her blood run cold even before she could see his face clearly. As he drew closer, recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her stepfather. He was older, grayer, but she would have known him anywhere, would have known that cruel set to his mouth, those cold eyes. Fear paralyzed her for a moment, her voice locking in her throat the way it used to, but then she thought of her children playing nearby, of Ethan in the barn, of the life she had built, and fury replaced the fear. She dropped the laundry and ran toward the house, her voice returning in a rush. "Ethan," she called loudly and clearly. "Ethan, come quickly." He emerged from the barn at her tone, took one look at her face, and immediately moved to her side. "What's wrong?" "That man," Sarah said, pointing at the approaching rider. "That's him, my stepfather." Ethan's face hardened in a way Sarah had rarely seen. He called out to Thomas, who had appeared at the barn door. "Take your brother and sister into the house and stay there." Thomas, hearing the urgency in his father's voice, obeyed immediately, herding his siblings inside despite their protests. The man had reached the yard now and dismounted. He looked Sarah up and down with a proprietary air that made her skin crawl. "So you did all right for yourself," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered, harsh and mocking. "Got yourself a husband and everything. Still can't talk, I'm guessing." "I can talk just fine," Sarah said, and her voice was steady despite the fear still churning in her stomach. "And you're not welcome here. Leave." He laughed. "That inheritance your daddy left you should have been mine. Your mother and I had legal rights to it, and you stole it when you ran." "I took what was mine," Sarah said, "and you have no claim on me or my property. Leave, or my husband will make you leave." Her stepfather's gaze shifted to Ethan, assessing. "So you're the man stupid enough to marry damaged goods. Did she tell you she can't talk? That she's broken?" "Watch your mouth," Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. "That's my wife you're speaking about, and I won't tolerate disrespect. Sarah has told me everything about you, everything you did to her. You have 10 seconds to get back on that horse and ride away, and if I ever see you near my property or my family again, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for assault. Or I'll handle it myself, and you won't like that outcome." "You can't prove anything," the man said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Actually, we can," Sarah said, finding strength in Ethan's presence beside her. "Dr. Henderson in Santa Fe treated me after you attacked me. He documented my injuries. The sheriff there knows what happened. And I imagine if we start asking questions, we'll find you have a reputation for violence. So please try something. Give my husband an excuse." Ethan's hand had moved to the gun at his hip, and there was no mistaking the threat in his stance. Sarah's stepfather looked between them, and whatever he saw in their faces made him step backward. "You're not worth the trouble," he muttered, but it was clear he had realized he was outmatched. He mounted his horse clumsily. "You always were a worthless girl." "And you were always a pathetic bully," Sarah said clearly. "Now get off my land and don't come back." They watched him ride away, and Sarah did not realize she was shaking until Ethan pulled her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked, holding her close. "I am now," Sarah said. "I was scared at first, but then I realized he has no power over me anymore. I have you, our children, our life. He's just a sad, angry man who can't hurt me." "He'll never hurt you," Ethan promised fiercely. "I'll make sure of it." Inside, the children were clustered at the window, and Thomas looked ready to fight despite his youth. "Who was that man?" he demanded. "Why did he upset Mother?" Sarah and Ethan exchanged a glance. And then Sarah sat down and told her children an age-appropriate version of her past. About the stepfather who had hurt her and stolen her voice. About running away and finding their father. The children listened with wide eyes, and when she finished, Elizabeth threw her arms around Sarah. "I'm glad you found Father," she said. "I'm glad you got away and came here." "So am I, sweetheart," Sarah said, holding her daughter close. "So am I." The confrontation with her stepfather had been frightening, but in a strange way, it also brought closure. Sarah had faced her abuser and found that he could no longer hurt her, that she was strong enough now to stand up to him. The nightmares she had occasionally still suffered ceased after that day, and she felt lighter, freer, as if a weight she had not realized she was still carrying had finally been lifted. Life continued its forward march. Thomas fell in love with a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and at 20, he married her in the same church where Ethan and Sarah had wed. It was a joyous occasion, and Sarah cried happy tears as she watched her oldest son begin his own family. Elizabeth surprised everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to be a teacher. Ethan and Sarah supported her decision, sending her to a teaching college in Santa Fe. She returned 2 years later with a certificate and a job offer at the school in Oro Grande, and she boarded with her parents while teaching the town's children. James, true to his restless nature, left at 19 to try his luck as a cowboy on the big cattle drives. Sarah worried constantly, but Ethan reminded her that young men needed to find their own paths. "He'll come back when he's ready," Ethan said. "This ranch will be here for him if he wants it." As their children grew and left and returned in their own ways, Ethan and Sarah grew older together. Gray threaded through Ethan's dark hair, and lines deepened around Sarah's eyes, but they still looked at each other with the same love and desire they had felt as newlyweds. On their 20th anniversary, Ethan took Sarah on a trip to Santa Fe, their first real vacation away from the ranch since they had married. They stayed in a hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and walked through the town like young lovers. On their last evening there, as they watched the sunset from a hilltop, Ethan took both her hands in his. 20 years, he said wonderingly. 20 years since I made the best decision of my life and asked you to marry me. 20 years since I found my voice, Sarah said. Since I found my home and my heart. I love you more now than I did then, Ethan said. I didn't think that was possible, but every year with you makes me love you more. I love you too, Sarah said. You gave me everything, Ethan. A life, a family, a voice. You gave me myself back. You did the same for me, Ethan said. I was half alive before you came. You made me whole. They kissed as the sun set, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting from their brokenness. James returned to the ranch when he was 25, ready to settle down after years of adventure. He had stories to tell, and a new maturity that came from seeing the world. He also brought home a wife, a spirited young woman he had met in Texas, and Sarah welcomed her new daughter-in-law with open arms. Thomas and his wife had given Sarah and Ethan 3 grandchildren, and Elizabeth had married the new doctor in Oro Grande and was expecting her first child. The ranch house that had once seemed so large and empty was now constantly filled with family, with grandchildren running through the rooms where Sarah and Ethan had once walked in lonely silence. One evening, when Sarah was 52 and Ethan was 62, they sat on the porch swing they had installed years ago, watching yet another New Mexico sunset. The ranch was thriving under Thomas and James's joint management. The grandchildren were healthy and happy, and life was good. Do you ever wish things had been different? Ethan asked suddenly. That you had found me sooner, that we had more years together. Sarah thought about it carefully. No, she said finally, because everything that happened, every hard thing, every painful moment led me here to you. If things had been different, we might never have found each other, and I wouldn't trade these 28 years with you for anything. 28 years, Ethan mused. It seems like both forever and no time at all. We'll have more, Sarah said confidently. Many more. We're not done yet, Ethan Nash. He laughed and pulled her close. No, we're not done yet. We still have grandchildren to spoil and gardens to tend and sunsets to watch together. And each other to love, Sarah added. And that most of all, Ethan agreed. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two people who had found each other in loneliness and fear, and built a life filled with love and family and joy. The scared woman who could not speak and the lonely rancher who waited for her had become partners in every sense of the word, building a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, Thomas and his wife helping their children with homework, James and his wife laughing over something in the kitchen. Tomorrow, Elizabeth and her family would come for Sunday dinner, and the house would be full of noise and chaos and love. Sarah leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her, and thought about how far they had both come. She had found her voice, literally and figuratively, had learned to speak and to stand up for herself, and to love without fear. Ethan had learned that loneliness was not the same as solitude, that sharing your life with someone made everything better, that love was worth the risk of opening your heart. Together, they had built something neither could have built alone. A family, a home, a love story that had started with fear and patience and grown into something strong and beautiful and enduring. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they finally went inside, hand in hand, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring as they had faced every day for the past 28 years. Together, the years that followed were quieter but no less full. Ethan eventually handed over most of the ranch operations to Thomas and James, though he still went out riding most days, unable to fully give up the work that had defined so much of his life. Sarah spent her days tending her garden, teaching her grandchildren to cook and sew, and writing in the journal she had kept since learning to speak again. She had documented their story in its pages, from that first terrifying day when she had hidden behind the water trough to the present, where she sat surrounded by the large, loving family she and Ethan had created. She wanted their grandchildren to know the story, to understand that love and patience could heal even the deepest wounds, that finding your voice sometimes meant finding the person who made you feel safe enough to speak. On a warm day in May of 1910, nearly 30 years after Sarah had first stumbled onto the ranch, Ethan took ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, and despite the doctor's best efforts, it developed into pneumonia. Sarah nursed him devotedly, rarely leaving his side, and their children and grandchildren kept constant vigil. On the third night, when his fever finally broke and the doctor said he would recover, Ethan opened his eyes to find Sarah sitting beside him, holding his hand, her face lined with worry. "Don't look so scared," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm not going anywhere yet. I have years left with you." "You better," Sarah said, her voice fierce. "I'm not done with you, Ethan Nash," he smiled weakly. "Good, because I'm not done with you either, Sarah Nash." He did recover, though it took weeks before he was back to his old self. The illness had scared them both, had reminded them that their time together, however long it had already been, was finite and precious. They made the most of every day after that, taking joy in small things. Morning coffee together on the porch, evening walks around the property, quiet hours reading side by side. They attended their grandchildren's school performances and birthday parties. They celebrated when Elizabeth's oldest daughter announced she wanted to be a teacher like her mother. They consoled Thomas when one of his sons decided to move to California to try his luck in the new automobile industry. Through it all, they loved each other with the depth that comes from decades of shared life, of weathering storms and celebrating joys together, of choosing each other every single day. On their 40th anniversary, in the spring of 1922, their entire extended family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were now 12 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, and the house and yard overflowed with people and noise and laughter. Sarah, now 71, and Ethan, now 81, sat in places of honor at the head of the long table that had been set up outside. As the sun began to set, Thomas stood and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled family. 40 years ago, my mother found refuge at this ranch, and my father found the missing piece of his heart. They built this family, this legacy, on a foundation of love and patience and respect. They taught us what real love looks like, not just passion and romance, though they certainly had that," he added with a grin as his parents laughed, "but also partnership and sacrifice and choosing to love each other even on the hard days. Thank you, Mother and Father, for showing us how it's done." "To 40 more years, to 40 more years," the family echoed, raising their glasses. Later, when the celebration had wound down and most of the family had headed home or to the bedrooms that had been prepared for them, Sarah and Ethan found themselves alone on the porch once more, their favorite spot for important conversations. 40 years, Sarah said softly. "I found you 40 years ago, scared and silent and broken, and you put me back together piece by piece." "You weren't broken," Ethan corrected gently. "You were wounded. There's a difference, and you healed yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it." "You gave me everything," Sarah insisted. "You taught me that love didn't have to hurt, that men could be gentle and kind. You waited for me to find my voice without making me feel less for not having it. You loved me even when I was silent. And you taught me that I didn't have to be alone," Ethan said. That sharing my life with someone was better than the solitude I had convinced myself I preferred. You brought joy and laughter and love into my world. You made me a husband and a father. You made me whole." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, holding hands the way they had held them thousands of times before. "You remember that first morning?" Sarah asked. "When you offered me coffee and I was so scared I almost ran." "I remember thinking you were the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, even scared and dusty," Ethan said. "And I remember feeling this pull toward you, this need to protect you and keep you safe." "I remember thinking you had kind eyes," Sarah said. "I was terrified of you because you were a man and a stranger, but your eyes were so kind. That's what made me stay that first night." "Best decision either of us ever made," Ethan said. "The best," Sarah agreed. As the night deepened, they finally went inside to the bedroom they had shared for 4 decades. They got ready for bed with the ease of long habit, and when they lay down together, Sarah curled into Ethan's side the way she always did, her head on his chest, his arm around her. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Ethan replied. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Nash, the very best thing." They fell asleep like that, 2 hearts beating in harmony, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would last for all time. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Ethan still sleeping peacefully beside her. She watched him for a long moment, taking in his dear face, the face she had looked at with love for 40 years. He seemed younger in sleep, the years and worry falling away, and she felt a surge of such profound love and gratitude that it brought tears to her eyes. This man had saved her life in every way that mattered. He had given her shelter and safety, yes, but also so much more. He had given her patience and understanding. He had given her time to heal. He had loved her when she could not speak and celebrated with her when she found her voice again. He had been her partner and her best friend, her lover and her confidant, the father of her children and the love of her life. She thought about that scared young woman who had stumbled onto this ranch so many years ago, and she wished she could go back and tell her that everything would be all right, that she would find love and happiness, and a home beyond her wildest dreams. She wished she could tell her younger self to be brave, to trust, to open her heart to the lonely rancher who would wait so patiently for her to heal. But then again, maybe her younger self had been brave. Maybe fleeing her stepfather, keeping herself alive, and accepting Ethan's help when it was offered had all been acts of courage. Maybe finding her voice had been the bravest thing of all. Ethan stirred beside her and opened his eyes, smiling when he saw her watching him. "Good morning, my love," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Sarah replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. "Happy day after our anniversary. The first day of our next 40 years together," Ethan said with a grin. Sarah laughed. "I like your optimism." They rose and dressed, moving through their morning routine with practiced ease. Sarah made breakfast while Ethan fed the chickens, the same division of labor they had worked out decades ago. The family members who had stayed over gradually emerged, and the house filled with noise and laughter once more. As Sarah stood at the stove, cooking eggs for her family, she felt Ethan come up behind her and wrap his arms around her waist, dropping a kiss on her neck. "I love you," he murmured. "I love you too," she replied, leaning back against him, feeling safe and loved and completely, utterly happy. This was her life. This was the life she and Ethan had built together from the ashes of her trauma and his loneliness. This was what had grown from that first day when a scared woman had found refuge with a kind man. This was what patience and love and time could create. A family, a legacy, a love story that would be told for generations. And as Sarah stood there in Ethan's arms, surrounded by the family they had created and the home they had built, she knew with absolute certainty that every hard thing she had endured had been worth it to get here, to this moment, to this life, to this love. She had found her voice all those years ago, but more importantly, she had found her home, her heart, and her happily ever after in the arms of the lonely rancher who had waited so patiently for her to heal. And that, Sarah thought as she turned in Ethan's arms to kiss him properly, ignoring the amused comments from their children, was the greatest gift of all.